I think it's time that we have this conversation about COVID. We've been going through the process of touching on it here and there, but not really delving in too deep on it. And so I'm glad that you guys are here, that we can be able to have this discussion tonight. And for those of you who are joining from home, I'm grateful that you guys are able to be a part of this discussion as well. We're going to go ahead and just start with a prayer at the beginning of this time. Please join me. God, we are grateful that you are a God who is above and beyond anything that we encounter throughout our lives, and that we can turn to you and we can trust what it is that you speak into our lives, God. We can trust your presence. We can trust your Spirit's presence in our life. And we pray that as we go through this evening and think about what some of this might mean to us, that we are able to continue to cling to who you are and who we are in your presence. In this we pray, amen. Thank you. So we are talking about it, and why now? Like, well, this has now been, eight months we've been in this? Why talking about it now? Part of it is I don't like having big discussions or preaching big sermons on Sunday morning. Sunday morning is a time where we are worshiping and we're gathering together in worship of God. However, I do think it's appropriate, and I've been wanting to have a conversation together about COVID for quite some time, but we've been in a great space. At the beginning, we were sheltered, being in a rural community. We didn't necessarily experience, I don't even have my mic on here right now. We didn't experience some of the things that some of the bigger cities were experiencing. We were kind of able to be a little bit removed from what was happening. And then as summer went on, we were able to enjoy the summer and the reprieve from some of the increases in the spread that was happening, but it's starting to come closer to home. It's starting to impact us, and there has not been a day that I have not had an urgent conversation with somebody from our church about how do we deal with COVID? How do we respond to COVID? And so this is the perfect time for us to talk about it now. Tonight is not about answers. I did not discover some secret information that suddenly makes everything clear. I do not have a suggestion. If you just follow these 10 steps, everything is going to be fine. That's not what tonight is about. Tonight, I want to share with you some of the ideas, some of the things that have been helpful for me, and maybe they will be helpful for you. To let you know a little bit about where I'm coming from, you know me as Pastor Heather, and you trust me to talk about the Bible, to talk about God. But for me to be talking about something else outside of that realm, you might want to understand where it's coming from, why I'm talking about it. And the first thing is to let you know that I have quite a bit of experience with research and data and how information is sorted and stored. I worked as a reference as a reference desk worker in a library. I was able to work significantly with lots of research, lots of how all that comes together and how that works. And I was also able to work with taking copious amounts of data, synthesizing it, and turning it into something that could be shared. That is a little bit of my background, and so that plays in very well on how we handle tonight in our conversation about this. I also want to share with you personally where I'm coming from this. Every single one of us has a personal experience that we are bringing to a conversation about COVID. And for me, several things are at play here. First of all, a year ago, almost to the day actually, I myself was, I came down with and diagnosed with bilateral pneumonia, which is I'm not saying I had COVID. What I am saying is that I recently enough went through a severe respiratory illness that I can vividly recall how difficult it was, what a significant impact it had on my life, and for a long duration of time. When we're talking about a disease that causes pneumonia, and quite often bilateral pneumonia, it is a serious issue, and so I have a little bit of a personal connection to that. Also, I've had the privilege of the last few months walking alongside people who have felt firsthand the impacts of some of the things we call lockdown measures, some of the things about isolation and some of the health restrictions that have had a profound impact on their lives. And I can see how that is not a far off thing, but that is a very real impact that exists. Also, I have a lot of personal investment, as every single other person does in this area. I'm a mother, I'm a wife, I have many loved ones, and things like the potential risk of a healthcare collapse or healthcare overload, things like long-term isolation, things like a long-term recovery economically, socially, all of those things I am just as invested in as everybody else is. I also want to just suggest that many of the things that I'll be bringing up tonight are things that I have touched on for not only the last 8 months, but even before then. And I don't bring this up and I don't point out this factor of consistency as a way to suggest that I'm more accurate because of it, but I want it to be an opportunity to maybe draw some comfort from the fact that what I'm sharing with you is the same thing I have been sharing for this whole time. And so maybe that'll be a little bit of a comfort during this conversation. For tonight, I want us to talk about a few different things. And the first thing I want to talk about is we're going to be talking about this information overload. There has been a glut of information that we've been absorbing these last few months. And the way that that is impacting us is significant. And I think it's important for us to want to go ahead and talk about that. How do we handle it? So we're going to be talking about handling this information overload and organizing information. We're also going to be talking about some tools that we can use, some skills we can develop to help us thrive during this time. This ability to get through this pandemic is not just about survival. It's also an opportunity for us to thrive, to grow, to develop, to be more than just let's get through it. And I think that that is a very real possibility for us, and I'd like us to pursue and think about that. I'd also like to consider, how do we respond? Ultimately, that is the question that we have been struggling with as individuals and as a community, even as a country, even as a global community. How do we respond to this pandemic? How do we respond to each other? How do we respond to ourselves? And that is going to be the main purpose and the main focus of what we are looking at tonight. The first thing I want to start with is suggesting to you that our mind is similar to our home. Our mind is where a lot of us live most of the time. That's where we spend a lot of our time. Some of us maybe more than others. And we each kind of have a unique setup in our mind. Some of us, it's pretty sparsely furnished maybe. For some of us, it's jam-packed. For some of us, it's neat and tidy. For some of us, maybe it's a little bit cluttered and chaotic. And for some of us, this is a significant issue for us right now. For many of us, the amount of information we've been taking in, it's led us to have a mind that resembles more an episode of Hoarders than anything else. We just have so much information, so many thoughts, so many things that have accumulated in our mind. We don't know what to do with it, and they are just piled up. And so this image, this idea of our mind is experiencing this hoarding phenomenon is something I want to explore a little bit tonight. The first thing is, of course, that's what's happening. We took in huge amounts of information in a very short time. Of course it is going to be piling up. Of course it is going to be causing clutter and chaos in our brains. I think it's worth starting acknowledging some of what this information is. For some of us, if we're used to stats and numbers, I know that that's not necessarily me, but sometimes I like that stuff. But the amount that's been coming, it's overload. For some of us, if we're not comfortable with those things in the first place, it's even more overwhelming. So let's first, by just taking a moment to talk about what stats, numbers, and infographics, what they mean for us, and acknowledging the fact that they only tell a part of the story. I have a graph here I want to share, and it might not be super easy to see on the screen for those at home, maybe even for you guys here, but this is maybe a familiar graph that you've seen. These are the case numbers in Alberta since March. So we see here that they went up, and then the top line here is the cumulative cases. That's all the cases that have happened in Alberta since March. This bottom one is active cases. So this number is continually always going up. This bottom one is going to rise and fall as the active cases rise and fall. And looking at this, we can gather some information. We can look at this and we can see a small part of what is happening. There's lots of variables involved. This doesn't tell us all the information, but it does tell us something. It tells us that as of now, over the course of this time, we have over 50,000 cases here in Alberta. Here we can see that there was a small increase. At the time, we didn't think it was small, right? Now we kind of considered a small increase in March, and now we see a bigger increase happening now. I think it's worth noting that there is some helpful information here, but it only tells part of the story, and it only tells part of the story in relation to just this very small amount. I've wondered for quite some time if we took this and we compared it to the entire population of Alberta, what it would look like. And that is what this next one is. So this is that exact same graph, but on the scale of the entire population of Alberta, which is 4.5 million roughly. So you can see down here, it doesn't even look like a graph, right? It looks almost just like it's just a solid line. Now the danger here with this information is that if you look at this one, it's kind of an alarming picture, right? It's kind of scary to see this. When we look at this, unfortunately, it has the exact opposite. Well, it's not that big of a deal. You can barely even see that it exists. So both charts give us some information, but not really enough information to tell us anything significantly. And that is something to be aware of at all times. Graphs, charts, stats, all those things that we're hearing all the time. They do give us some information. They are helpful, but they don't give us an adequate picture. They don't show the whole picture. It is a small portion, which means at times it is at best inadequate to give us a full picture of what's happening when we look at these graphs, when we look at these stats, when we go online and we see, even though it is helpful data, it's inadequate at best. At worst, it is misleading. And that is something that that's the next two charts I'm going to show you, because I think this is where it's significant for us to understand the information we're not acknowledging. Not that it's being withheld, but we're just not acknowledging it. So this is a bar graph, and this shows us that as of yesterday, the number of deaths that have been attributed to COVID in Alberta is 510 deaths. That's significant. These are not just numbers, these are people who have died. And that needs to matter. We cannot ignore it and we cannot trivialize it. But when we fail to look at other areas of information around this number, we do just that. We trivialize death. We trivialize tragedy. We trivialize people who've experienced death. And I'm going to show you this next graph, which is this. So this down here is the 510 deaths attributed to COVID in Alberta since the beginning of this pandemic. This here is the number of deaths that on average would have occurred during that time in Alberta anyway. In 2019, Alberta on average each month experienced 2,249 deaths per month for the course of 2019. If that stayed true in Alberta for 2020, we would expect to see about that same number of deaths. So over the course of this time where we experienced 510 tragic deaths, we experienced, and this is where there's lots of variables, but we could reasonably have experienced over 20,241 deaths. I think it's important to recognize that every time we see a stat and it shows us a piece, there might be another piece that also needs acknowledgement. And I think this is important. I think it's important for us to not only say that the deaths that happen due to COVID matter, but other deaths matter as well. And it's not to trivialize, it's not to take away, it's not to say somehow we shouldn't be doing anything to address that, but if we fail to ever acknowledge the other deaths that are happening, then we are trivializing those other deaths. And I think that that's an important thing for us to be aware of, that at best when we see stats, at best when we see numbers, infographics, charts, it is giving us a piece of the pie, not the whole thing. Next, research and what we know. There was that famous video of the Auto-Tunes song from the throne speech with these are the things we know. And we seem to want to know exactly what's going on. That's human nature. When something is uncertain, when something is going on that we don't know what to do with, we want facts. We want hard, fast information so that we can know what is happening. The difficulty when it comes to a brand new disease, even a disease that has other similar diseases we can learn from, is that it's like doing a jigsaw puzzle, but you're only given a couple pieces at a time. So we have this jigsaw puzzle, this huge puzzle of COVID, and we are missing most of the pieces. That's just, it's not anybody's failure, it's not anybody's fault. Nobody's withholding this information. It just isn't there yet because we haven't found it yet. And because of that, one of the things that scientists, researchers do, this is a practice that has been around for many years, is they find something similar, they take the things they know about that and apply it to the unknown. And that's what's happening a lot with COVID. That is a sound practice when it comes to how we study new diseases. It is a sound practice in a time where we need to make decisions and we don't have those hard and fast answers. That's a very normal practice, but it's worth us acknowledging that that is what we know. We do not have for sure answers to some of the questions. And when we hear things like, we know COVID only lasts 3 days on a plastic surface. Well, actually, we don't know that for sure. They hear that we know for sure COVID is not airborne. Well, we don't know that for sure. We're making a very good, there's scientists who are making a very good guess at it, but we don't know for sure yet. And it's not to say that we shouldn't listen to that information. It's just that we should acknowledge it for what it is. It is acknowledgement that we don't know for sure, but we're gathering from other things that we know. This is what we can guess about it. The last thing when it comes to understanding data is that any time that we are given information, numbers, statistics, cases, research data, anytime we are given data, it is our job, humans' jobs, to interpret that data. Which means if we have data, we are required to assign meaning to it. An example of this would be to say, okay, in Cold Lake, we currently, I think as of today, it's 62 cases, active cases, 62 active cases of COVID in Cold Lake. That is data. There are 62 people who have tested positive in Cold Lake. That's data. What does it mean? Well, the data doesn't tell us what that means. It just gives us this statement. 62 people have tested positive in Cold Lake. What that means to us is where we have to assign meaning to that data. We have to go, well, that means it's less than yesterday because there's been some recoveries, but it's far more than it was 2 weeks ago, right? We have to assign, well, what does that mean? What does that tell us? That's something we do. And then the next part of this interpretation of data is the process of the peer-reviewed process. And this is something that in popular cultures and when we're sitting around, scientists say, they say, experts say this. They say something, right? This is what it means. But the peer-reviewed process is a little bit more complicated than that. And one of the big reasons why is that experts do not always agree. Who remembers from, I think it was maybe the 70s or 80s, the Trident, Wrigley Trident, their big advertising was 4 out of 5 dentist surveys would recommend Trident for their patients who chew gum. Does anybody remember that? I remember that, and I remember always being confused. Why 4 out of 5? Like, did they only pick 5 dentists? Did they get all of them together? How did they get to this number of 4 out of 5 dentists? And why not all of them? Why not every dentist? Because that's not how experts work. There's always some discussion, there's always some disagreement, there's always a new idea that's trying to be heard, or there's an old idea that's being disproved. It is not a hard and fast, all doctors think this. It is not a hard and fast, all epidemiologists think this. And I think it's really important for us to acknowledge that and be aware of it, that when we hear advice, when we hear information from a credible expert source, that we can understand that there is some reason to give it credence, but that it's not solid given fact, and that there is a little bit of interpretation that revolves around that. The reason I am talking about all of this, the reason I am going over these conversations, is because I think it has become clear that we need to acknowledge that more information is not our answer out of this. Just continuing to say, well, we just have to wait for the answers. We just have to wait for the answers. Then we can know what to do. I think it's time for us to admit that that's not necessarily going to be the best way. Information is going to be helpful. It's going to be very good for us to continue to listen and understand when we do hear that information, but it is not the only thing that we can wait for. It cannot be our sole reliance for how we go forward. And this question of how do we respond is the same question we've had for 8 months, and we can't keep waiting for the answer. We have to maybe see if there is a different way to answer that question. I think ultimately we are going to need to develop some tools, some skills, if we are going to respond well. We do need to respond. We do need to respond well, not to just react and just hope for the best. We need to do well at this. And I think it's vital for us to understand that we need tools and skills in order to do this. And when I talk about tools and skills, I'm not talking about skills to show off, to be like, ooh, look how talented I am. Look at how amazing I am. The purpose for having these skills that we're talking about tonight, the whole entire purpose of them is to use them for times like these, so that we know how to respond. We know how we can be able to live now. We know how we can thrive now. And so I'm going to start with talking about our first skill, because it relates directly to all of this that we just talked about. Protecting our home brain space, protecting that mind home that we have, finding a way to tackle that information overload that is causing chaos and clutter in our minds. First thing to recognize is that it is up to you, up to each individual on being able to tackle this aspect and to develop this skill. There's a little bit of a dangerous idea that's being passed around right now, and it's the idea that unless you are an expert, you are disqualified from making your own opinion. And I think that's very dangerous, because it takes the onus of who has to determine, who has to take care of that mind space, and saying, let somebody else figure it out, and then just trust them, and you don't have to do any work. And I think that's a dangerous idea, because it is up to us in order to tackle this information overload. Has anybody seen an episode of The Hoarders? Have you guys ever watched those? Yeah, I love those shows. I think they're really fascinating. And every time, the first thing they do is they uncover the real problem. People go and collect too much stuff. People buy too much stuff. We have that habit because we're trying to address a different need. We buy too much because we're trying to build another life. We buy everything on sale because we feel out of control in another area. And this is no different. If we're going to attack the clutter and the chaos that exists in our mind, we have to start by addressing the real problem. And one of the biggest areas is, I'm going to say this, I talked about this a little bit at Lent time, and I'm going to talk about it again. Beware about watching the news, press releases, and constant updates, because it feels productive. It feels like we are doing something. It feels like we are contributing somehow. But constantly watching the news, constantly watching the press releases, constantly looking for new information, it feels productive, but it's a consumer experience. It's just like trying to address a need of frustration over feeling out of control or building a better life by going to the store and buying an entire case of shampoo. It's not really productive. We're just consuming something to feel better, but the result is not necessarily that. In fact, the result at best is we are simply not contributing at all. At worst, we're actually feeding and causing a real problem for ourselves by doing this. Stop bringing things in to your mind that you don't need to bring in. Watch out for it. Watch out for the junk. If you don't want to have a mind that looks like it belongs on an episode of Hoarders, you have to watch out for what you're bringing into it. That means paying attention to 3 different things. Paying attention to the source. Where is this information coming from? Why is it something that you should be listening to? Listening, why is it the source matters. Pay attention to the source. The content of it. What is the content? Is this something that is actually going to contribute in how you are productive in your daily life? Is it going to be something that is going to help you in how you respond and how you are a part of our community? Or is it something that's going to cause anxiety? Is it something that's just going to cause you to go down a rabbit hole of frustration and irritation? Is it something that you even need to be concerned about? Sometimes the answer is yes. Lots of times the answer is no. Chris is really good about telling me, should you really be reading that right now? And that's a very good question. Should I even be reading this right now? Should I even be listening to this right now? And lastly, the amount matters. Even if the source is reliable, even if the content is stuff that is helpful for you to know, you can have too much. Listening every day, reading every day, watching every day to the news and the updates, it is going to have an impact. It's just like the going and buying a case of shampoo. Shampoo is good, but unless you're a specialized person in the field, you do not need an entire case of it. And bringing a case in is just going to add to clutter. So it's important to watch out for the 3 ways that it can be junk. A bad source, content that's just not even needed, and how much you bring in. Even if it is a good thing, too much can still be a problem. With that idea about controlling the amount of what comes in, okay? You're good about checking your sources. You're good about making sure that what you're reading is actually relevant and matters, and it's something that you should know about and pay attention to. You still can control the rate of intake. I think it's very interesting to note that there is a huge difference in how we consume content and understand material when it's spoken to us, when we hear it, when we watch it, and when we read it. Because when we're talking, when I'm talking to you, when you are listening to a news program on the radio, when you are watching a news program on TV, you cannot control the rate at which you absorb information. It comes at you, and you can't take a pause to look away and think about it. You can't stop to go and do a fact check. You just absorb it all, and then afterwards you have this huge amount of information you kind of have to pick through or just set aside because it's too overwhelming. If at all possible, do your best to try to read. If you watch programs, that's fine. If that's the best source for you, that's fine. But as much as possible, try to do your finding information by reading about it, because you can control the rate of how much information you take in. Information is helpful. I don't want to poo-poo the idea of somehow we shouldn't trust data or stats or numbers or what the CDC is telling us. I'm not saying that at all. I am suggesting it is helpful, but I think that we do need to look elsewhere for our true guidance of how we should respond. It needs to be something bigger, something outside of the realm of just data, which can be, at times inadequate and at worst misleading. So where else do we look? What are we going to do if we are going to try to figure out how do we respond if it's not going to be just with information. And this is going to be where we're going to take a quick break. And we are going through a lot of information. I understand that. I'm wanting to have a break if you need to get a drink of water, if you need to go to the bathroom, or I'd like this to also be an opportunity if you have a question. Is there something that I've said tonight that you guys have a response or a question to? Steve?